All right, so we just want to take a little bit of time to kind of finish up part 2 of our Can We Trust the Bible series. If you remember, we're trying to build confidence in the New Testament. All right, and remember, if I can get to have confidence about what it says about Jesus, the fact that Jesus had confidence in the Old Testament is how I'm going to get there. So I'm doing a very specific approach. Can I have confidence in the Gospels and their proclamation of the resurrection? All right, so that's what I'm trying to get to ultimately, because that gives me confidence in the rest of it. So I start out, can I trust my translations? And we looked at that, and we recognized that our translations go back to the original language. We don't have any copies of the original letters, but the translations are not translating other translations. They're going back to the original wording, and they're coming from that. The fact that we have a lot of translations gives us more confidence as we see that they're all basically saying the same thing. It helps us to weed out the bad ones, and it helps us to know that what we're reading is really what was intended for us to know and to understand. So that's the translations part. We're right now in the transmission of it. Okay, so how did it get from the original author to us? And we looked at, we're not reading copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. In many circumstances, we believe we're reading copies, period. That these weren't like 800 years later, that many of the things we have are only 65 years to about 165 years separated from when the original was written. And as much as they were valued, they were well preserved. They were well taken care of. It wasn't on flimsy throwaway. Somebody didn't write it on the back of a napkin because it was unimportant. These were things that were treasured. They were cared for. And so we can trust that what we're looking at is, in fact, copies of what Paul himself wrote, what Matthew himself wrote, those kinds of things. Now, we do need to address and be honest that there are variations. All right, and we recognize that those variations, a lot of times, even when you read a good translation, it will tell you. Some manuscripts say and will give you what that variation is. All right, so some of them are big like that. Some of the variations we have to put in there. We're not sure what it really means. You know, with the it was some say this and some we don't know which it is, but it gives it to you. But most of the variations come from different things, like I showed you last week. They're letters that look the same, but they're not the same. And so one manuscript has an alpha when another has an omicron. And the difference in that is basically just a little hook on the letter. And it's easy to see how a copyist could see one and write the other. So we have those kinds of variations. Here are some others, and this is where I'm going to have you guys start advancing for me. Some of those variations are where they fixed a misspelled name. So they recognized, all right, here in this copy right here, here's this person's name, but we know that it's not supposed to be alpha, that it's supposed to be omicron here. And so I recognize I'm coming off a bad copy, I'm going to fix that. And they change it based on knowing how the name was supposed to be spelled, but that's a variation. All right, so they're trying to get back to the original. It would have read this. Some copyist got it wrong. I'm going to fix it so some of the other scrolls take care of that. A big one right here is the grammatical issues. All right, in Greek, we have past tense, present tense, future tense. There are 18 tenses in Greek. All right, in most of those tenses are the variation of one letter. And so when you're copying from one, if you change one letter, you change the grammar of a sentence. And if you're talking about the future, but you've used the past tense, you realize that's a grammar issue. So some of them, that's what's happening. You have a grammar issue that's going on. So a copyist either fixed it or they made it when they were copying it. All right? So again, it's not changing our theology. It's small, I would call often small things like that. Now here's the one that troubles some people. Explanatory additions. All right, so what would happen is this. A sentence is given, and then in the copy, the sentence is a little bit longer or has a couple of extra words in it. It's a variation, but what's happened is the copyist has attempted to explain what the original said. If you remember when I said context can really mess us up in the translations, I gave the example of this morning I shot a man in my pajamas. Okay? And so, was I in my pajamas or was the man in my pajamas? We don't know. And if context doesn't tell you what it is, the sentence remains unclear. Well, sometimes the copyists knew the situation, and so they would change the sentence a little bit in order to make the right reality clear in the text. So the copyist might take my sentence and write, while I was in my pajamas, I shot a man. So if he knew that was the situation, even though that wasn't the original sentence, good to see you, Charlton, even though that wasn't the original sentence, he added some explanatory words so that the readers in the future would know the situation. Well, I read a police report somewhere else and realized that Steve had woke up, he got out of bed, was in his pajamas. When he saw a man, he was alarmed for his family, so he shot him. Steve was in his pajamas, so he changed the sentence, while I was in my pajamas, I shot a man. Right. So that explains some of these variants that we get in manuscripts. They're trying to give right information to future readers, knowing that without the context, the reader won't be able to understand the grammar of the sentence. I see deep thought there. Is that about this or is something else? Okay, I'm with the mask on, I can never tell there. So these explain the large majority of the, remember, 400,000 variations that we have. But that number is absolutely nonsense because it includes non-biblical sources. It includes, if that variation appears in 11 manuscripts, then it's 11 variations instead of one. So it's really a nonsense number. But most of them are taken care of in those categories. So does that make sense on how we can trust that what we're looking at, the scrolls that we're looking at now, really do reflect what Paul wrote, what Matthew wrote, what Luke wrote? Are there other concerns that you might have that we want to address before going on to the next issue that we have? That's one of the big issues of do we have the right books? Any other questions? You go on this side. Yes.
Okay, so like on the explanatory additions.
Yes.
Is that the instances where there might be a footnote or something where it says some translations say, and then reworded in a different way or something like that?
Most of those explanatory additions, because we have so many copies that are so close to the original, we can recognize it would make sense that these words would be added rather than these words would be left out. So, you know, if you have that sentence, it wouldn't make sense to go from while I was in my pajamas, I shot a man to this morning, I shot a man in my pajamas. It doesn't make sense to go backwards. So we know what that is. So then we put in a footnote. Some manuscripts read, and we would give the original reading, because the later one can help us to understand what it is, or sometimes they put it the other way. And normally they'll tell you that. The earliest manuscripts say, so if they're using the explanation notes rather than what the oldest ones say, they will put in there the earliest manuscripts say. And most of the time when you read that, it's not as clear as what's up here. But if you're looking to try to get back, I only want what Paul wrote here, then stick with the earliest what the earliest manuscripts say. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Another one then. I don't know that it fits in that category.
That's right. Fire away.
There's like one chapter, and I can't remember where it is. It's like there's several verses.
It's in, probably you're talking about John.
Yes.
Yes.
There's several verses.
Yes.
Where some Bibles don't include.
Yeah, the end of chapter 7 into chapter 8.
And others do, and I think
Correct.
there's a footnote usually that says this is not in some manuscripts.
Correct. The earliest manuscripts don't have it. And that one has a real problem. So what he's talking about is Matthew 7:53 to 8:11. I think if you go there, you'll see it. I actually preached on it not too long ago. The woman caught in adultery. And I said when I first started, I didn't even know if I was going to preach it because it's so questioned. That's a passage that the oldest manuscripts don't have it there, but equally old have it later in John. We actually have some manuscripts that have that story at the end of Luke. So it's a story that appears in a lot of manuscripts, but in different places, and we don't know how do we handle that. So what translators do is, look, it's in a lot of manuscripts. We're not sure where it came from, so we're going to put it where it appears most frequently, and we're going to put huge notes on it saying, danger, danger. Now, part of the reason they do that is because back in 1611, when the King James Version was translated, we did not have as old of manuscripts as we found now. When the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran, we found lots of much older fragments that were available in 1611. And so that story had become so paramount and beloved, the idea of just no longer including it would have been blasphemous to many Christians. But to do it without making huge marks in your Bible, and in fact, I don't care, any of your translations that you have other than King James will have huge, there's no way you can get into that passage without coming across. It's not a footnote. They put it in the body of the text. These verses are not here. All right? Or don't appear here and everything. And so again, that's us trying to be as faithful in the transmission as possible to say, look, we see it a lot, but we want you to know these may not have come originally from John. I've seen a lot of recent arguments that give really good evidence that it probably did come from John. Now, whether John wrote it in that gospel or whether it was somewhere else and some copyist brought it from where it was else into his gospel, we don't know. And I don't think we'll ever know with certainty. But there's nothing taught in that passage that contradicts any other teaching of Scripture. But I would never base an entire doctrine on that passage. If that's the only support you have, I wouldn't trust it. Yep, great question. All right, and that happens in other places. And that's, if you hear people make arguments for King James only, most of the time they'll say, well, there are several verses that other translations leave out. The reality is that's only half true. They may leave it out so as if you're reading just in the text and you ignore the bottom of the page, you wouldn't know that it was there. But almost every one of the verses, the people that support King James Version only, if you look, there's a number in that verse. Some manuscripts include this verse. And oftentimes the verses even skip. So it'll go like 51, 52, 54, 55. You're like, where'd 53 go? It's at the bottom. But they numbered it that way, so you've got to go down and look for it because it probably wasn't in the original. Yep, that's how. So we're trying to be as honest as we can when there is a transmission question to make sure everybody knows there might be a question here. And that gives us more confidence in the transmission of it rather than less confidence. Because we're just putting it all out there. Here it is. Here's where there might be something different. And none of those variations that I just talked about affect a single Christian doctrine that we have. None of them. So that's good news. Other questions before we move on to the 66 books of the Bible?